So in a surprise to absolutely no one, it turns out that the United Arab Emirates, a Middle East petrostate, has been illegally donating money to American politicians. The UAE apparently has been trying to get their money into America because, of course, it's illegal for foreign governments or foreign citizens to donate to American campaigns, because the idea is that foreigners aren't supposed to have influence over American politics. It's supposed to be that only Americans have a say in what happens as far as our elections go. But of course, everyone is well aware that countries like Saudi Arabia or Israel, or in this case the UAE, get certain preferential treatment and have, well, you could say some sort of favored status with regards to their dealings with the American government, and that this favored status extends a little further than just the interests of the American people. Now, foreign influence in American politics is nothing new. I think probably the most insidious example that I can think of off the top of my head is the First World War, in which British influence over American politics, in the form of loans, loans given by bankers to the British government to fund the war effort, heavily influenced the U.S.'s decision to enter into World War I on the side of the British, despite the fact that there were a lot of Americans at that time who were quite sympathetic to the German side of the war, but the bankers, their interests lied with the Brits. But in that case, at least things were a little more indirect, because you still had American bankers who were the ones lobbying the American politicians to try and get them into the war on Britain's side, even though Britain was, in turn, lobbying those bankers. But in this case with the UAE, it is plain to everyone that there are no Americans who stand anything to gain from the influence that they are peddling. The UAE had an American collaborator by the name of George Nader, whose name you may remember from the Mueller investigation. I don't follow the Mueller investigation too closely because it really was kind of a non-issue as far as I'm concerned. I didn't think that the Mueller thing was that there was ever going to be anything that came of that. But George Nader was a big witness to the special counsel, and so his name, by coincidence, seems to be popping up again. He's one of those guys, kind of like Paul Manafort, that he's a political gun for hire, and he will work for whoever at any given time, whoever's going to pay him to do his dirty deeds. And so the UAE tasked him with taking money from them that they gave to him and then trying to distribute it amongst a bunch of other individuals, apparently about 7 that are being named, well, not named directly, but 7 is the number that we've got that are being prosecuted for this conspiracy to try and distribute the United Arab Emirates government money to various political campaigns and I'd imagine political action committees across America. And so this is how they were trying to get their influence into American politics, is to indirectly donate to these guys by laundering their money through these other individuals like George Nader and the other men. The UAE, of course, is a pretty small state in the Middle East. They were invented by the British back after World War II, and they essentially exist to extract oil and export it. They have a pretty weak military because they are so small, and probably if it weren't for, well, entirely certainly if it weren't for British and American patronage, the UAE would not exist today. Even if it was created by the British, it would have been absorbed into some bigger power in the Middle East. It would have been conquered by who knows whether it'd be Arabia or Iraq or Iran. Somebody would have taken them out. They're quite vulnerable, being such a weak state and such a dangerous neighborhood. So they very much have an interest in making sure that American foreign policy aligns with their interests. And to that end, they focused their efforts in 2016 on supporting Hillary Clinton, who was seen as the heir apparent, I guess you could say, to the presidency. And on top of that, someone who is known for being willing to play ball when it comes to American politics, particularly American foreign policy. She was Secretary of State for quite a few years, and she didn't rock the boat or anything like that. In fact, Hillary was quite content taking donations from all sorts of groups when it came to giving speeches through her racket, the Clinton Foundation. And I believe the UAE gave over like 3.6 million, I guess, collectively that they've found so far, and that they've been able to launder into Hillary's campaign or into PACs that supported Hillary. But after 2016, of course, Hillary did not win, and their investment really went bust. So they decided to turn their funds and spread it out a little more broadly and make sure that they didn't have all their eggs in one basket. And that's when they started donating to all sorts of Democrats and Republicans all across the country. Sure, they wanted to make sure that they had enough friends in Congress to overcome whatever Trump's urges may be, especially since they didn't give any money to Trump, and so they might be on his bad side, you could say. From my perspective, it seems like the UAE's efforts were generally a success. In Washington, the petrostates have always been quite popular. They've done a very good job managing their public relations, despite the fact that they are rather backward and tyrannical. You know, all these donations being funneled to members of both parties is a good anecdote to demonstrate why there exists a bipartisan foreign policy consensus, and why, in many cases, this whole partisan divide is such a fiction. Because at the end of the day, when it comes to what I would consider to be the most important issues, politicians generally agree with one another. You have the rare dissenters, folks like perhaps Dennis Kucinich or Ron Paul or Jimmy Duncan or, well, I guess from time to time you could say Bernie Sanders, but Bernie Sanders doesn't really care about foreign policy, it seems. But other than that, people of both parties go along to get along. Because foreign policy is something that it's kind of seen above partisan politics. And, a naive person may say, well, that's because, we Americans all have, a common interest when it comes to what goes on in our position, in the world more broadly. But in reality, it's just because all the politicians are feeding from the same foreign trough. They all very eagerly lap up the slop from the Arab monarchies and from Israel and from well, probably other countries that don't get as much publicity. I'm sure that there are lots of countries that have complicated foreign influence operations in America. It's just the most egregious of them, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, that get all the attention. I wouldn't be surprised if India, for example, had not that I'm accusing them of anything, but it wouldn't shock me if we found out that they had some kind of influence campaign in America. Of course, people have accused the Chinese in the past of doing similar things. Of course, in that case, it's a little harder for them to hide, since China is generally considered by the bipartisan foreign policy establishment to be an enemy. And so this story, while not at all shocking to someone like me, is something that you really could show an ordinary American and try to wake them up a little bit about just what the nature of politics is and how democracy, so-called, works in America. I think stories like this give us civilians a little bit of a peek into just how decisions are made in places like Washington, and that the myth we're all taught in school about how a bill becomes a law and how people of differing interests just come together and they make compromises and then they decide to pass a law that's just about what's best for everybody. That's all nonsense, and that really us ordinary people have zero influence when it comes to these sorts of things, and that at the end of the day we're all just pawns in their little game. So with that said, if you gained anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe, because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.